anglers, thanks for stopping in. This is gonna be a great video today, guys. I did a presentation at Strictly Sail about springtime pre-spawn bass fishing. Put a lot of really good info. I'm Kurt Smits, your 2017 KBF National Champion, top 10 ranked in the Hobie Bass Open Series for 2021. I'm a springtime angler. That's where I do my best, is in early spring, pre-spawn. I'm an early season guy. I'm breaking down 3 of my biggest tournaments. One of them being the KBF National Championship in 2017. One of them being Norman, which I won, and then Barr, where I got 3rd. And these are 3 great examples of how I found the bass in early springtime pre-spawn bass fishing. So let's get into it. Hope you guys like it. Well, guys, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming to Strictly Sail. Big shout out to Strictly Sail for having us and allowing us to do these presentations for you guys. We're going to be talking about pre-spawn bass fishing and how to find the better quality fish for the pre-spawners. There we go. So some of the first things that we're looking for and you want to start thinking about are where the bass are going to be pre-spawn, you know, and what part of the pre-spawn are you talking about, because pre-spawn runs from being in a winter pool, being very deep, all the way up to right before they spawn, right before they go to the beds. So everything is affected by water temperature. That is the biggest contributing factor for when these fish are going to spawn and where you're going to find them in their movement. And the other thing you're going to want to consider is bait size for the springtime. I feel like it goes one of 2 ways, small or big. I don't like to do anything in the middle. I like to either throw really small baits that are matching the small springtime shad, or I want to throw big baits like Kyler's going to show us here, that are imitating the bigger shad that have lived through the winter, that can handle all the stresses of the weather changes that happen. And here's a perfect example. You want to match the hatch. This is a typical bait I throw right here. This is what I feel like is a typical springtime shad. And you see how close they are in color and size. It's so important to match it in the springtime, because these fish, I find, unless you just happen to find some super random aggressive fish, they'll key in on a specific size, a specific color in the springtime. They will only hit that type of stuff. You know, and we're competing with them eating shad. So at this time of year too, I will avoid spots that are full of shad. Like if you come into a bay and there's nothing but shad side to side, I feel like that is not the place for me, because I feel like I'm competing way too much with the natural species there the fish are all going to be eating on, versus giving them something that looks a little different. If I can find places that have shad balls kind of spread out here and there, and you can see them like where they're balls and not just these big like wandering ocean looking things on your side scan or on your fish finders, that's what I look for. And when you find the balls, generally speaking, that's when they're being predated on. Shad really ball up. I mean, there'll be circular balls on your fish finder when you see them on there. So what we need to do is, the next part is going to be breaking down the water to find where they're going to be. And I always start deep, and I follow old creek beds because they tend to be highways for the fish. And you want to find a creek bed that you can actually see, because some lakes silt in, so there will be no creek bed. It'll be a flat bottom. But when you can go over it with your fish finder and see a 2-3 foot drop, hit the other side and it bumps up, follow that creek bed from the deepest part to the shallowest part, and that's where you're going to find the fish, somewhere along that highway, because that's the highway they're using. They're following these creek beds. I got some maps to show you here in a second. But you also want to keep an eye out for where the fish are going to stop on the way up to the spawning spots, because you know, weather changes, right? It turns to this, it goes cold, it gets warm, it goes cold, it gets warm. Those fish move up and then they pull back. But they're not just pulling back, they're pulling back to a spot that they feel comfortable in. For whatever reason, whether it's structure, whether there's bait there, whether it's out of the wind, there's a lot of different reasons they'll stop places. But those are the spots you're going to want to find on the way up. And then finally, you want to find the spawning areas at the end of the creeks when they kind of shallow out, because that's where they're going. If you can find an old spawning area, we can find old beds and then backtrack, somewhere in that route, those fish are going to be. So this is a shot of Lake Norman. And just to give you an idea, these are all the creek bed channels coming up. Every single one of those, right? That's a lot to cover. And you're probably saying, Kurt, man, how am I gonna break this down? How am I gonna cover all these things? Well, first you're gonna take a look at where the possible spawning areas are, right? Flat protected area, really good possible spawning area. Another spot back here. Now some of these creeks that they're not showing on here that you would use like Google Earth to find out before you got there, or if you're on the lake, the ones that have like a creek flowing into them, let's say this creek arm had a creek flowing into it, more than likely they're not going to spawn right here, back in there, because every time it rains, it's going to get blown out. Where you would possibly find them is back in here, real close to there, right? And it's off the creek. But you want to find where they're going to spawn at, because that way, you know this is the route they're taking. So when I talk about the spots that they hang out at during their migration to their spawning flats, so they're going to spawn back in here, they're going to spawn back in here, they're going to spawn back in here. All these spots that are protected out of the wind that are flats, these are the places that I tend to find them. And at Norman, this is exactly where I found them. As I come back up this creek, going from deep to shallow, I didn't find them, and I found some small schools of fish around these humps. And it was 55-degree water, so it wasn't super warm water. So I was expecting to find them in 12 to 20 feet of water, but in reality, because they're fish, they do weird things. They had moved up, and they were moved up like really dense and thick schools. They were making the surge, and they were piling up on these points because the water was only 55 degrees. It was 70 during the day. Cold front came in, held them up. They stopped. The ones that were moving up stopped moving up, and some kept coming. So stacked up on these points, and just behind the points, I was finding these giant schools of fish. They were stacked up ridiculous on them. And then there was some other features that helped key the fish on, and it was, so when I say they were on these points, these were rocky points in particular. These points had big rock, then also had small gravel rock on it. And like where this point that came out here was more of like a mud point, and they weren't holding fish. So the fish were keying on big structure, big rock, right? And right here, there was some tires. Someone had dumped a bunch of tires in there and made a tire, I don't know what it was, just a pile of tires. And I kept on seeing fish around it in practice, but I couldn't get any of them to bite. So I just keyed in on these main points, right? And it was so classic in how the fish were stacking up and feeding, because they were actively feeding. But it was a morning bite, right? Like just in the springtime, they were getting super aggressive. But then when they would die down, I would start moving over to the docks and start fishing the docks and picking them off the docks. And when I got to the tires started holding fish later in the day that I didn't realize from practice, and paid off big time. And what that means is they're holding to structure. They're holding to things. So when you go to some lake you've never been to, and you're trying to figure out where the fish are going to be in the early spring, follow those creeks up from the deepest parts up. Now the next thing to figure out is, once you find the fish, is where are the better quality fish? Because everyone's going to find fish. And figuring out where the better quality fish was all about these rocks. Wherever the rocks were bigger and there was more chunk, like, I don't even know how to say it, they were like 5-foot boulders here, and there were 5-foot boulders over here, but almost none of the other points, they were either gravel or mud, and they just weren't holding fish. And if they were holding fish, they were just bucks. They're 12 to 15 inches. Where here, this is where I found all the fish to win that tournament from, was only in 3 spots, really. If you count this as one spot, 2 spots, 3 spots. for the winning fish. And I didn't even spend any time fishing the docks back in here, or the docks out here, or any of these other points, because I'd already determined that's where the small fish were. And almost always bigger fish are gonna respond and be around bigger structure. So the bigger the structure, the better, whether it's trees, gravel, boulders. And this right here is a picture of my fish finder off that big point I showed you, right? That's this right here. And that's what it looked like underneath me. What was going on is they were just swimming around. You can see how much time I spent just on that one point. I spent probably half the tournament there. Crazy. And this goes to like what Grimsley was saying, having good electronics. And I don't even want to say these are good electronics. This is my old fish finder from years ago. It's just a regular Humminbird Helix, not a Mega or anything. So it's a very rudimentary fish finder. But being able to know how to read them, understand them, you don't have to have the fanciest fish finder, but you're not going to see fish 12 feet deep otherwise. You're not going to even know they're down there unless you're just randomly tossing there. And so now this is going to be Watts Barr. And what attracted me to this area on the map was, again, this is early spring, pre-spawn, water's low 50s, deep area with creek beds running up in the green. And what really got me peaked on this when I was doing the map study was all the road beds, and these squares are old building structures. So there was just tons of structure in every depth of water. I mean, it comes up to 11, 10 feet, comes up to 12 feet, you got it down to 30 feet, you got it down to 40 feet, you have bridges, you have old buildings. And so all I did was I started following these creeks up. I followed one all the way to the back, didn't find anything, followed another one up to another creek end, didn't find anything. And then I came up to these islands, followed these roads around, didn't find much on the roads, found a few fish, but nothing that really keyed me in to say, hey, these are the better quality fish. Again, it was just smaller fish spread out on the typical places. They were hanging out in the bridges, they were hanging out in the old building structures. And I came around the island looking, and I kept on expecting them to be deep because it was such a wicked cold front that came through. I mean, it was snowing like this that year for it. But then when I came all the way up to this marina, and I found right here they had started making beds, but there were no fish on them because they had pushed back off. And right here, big, huge bed areas on either side of this marina. Those fish that had started making those beds pulled back just a few feet into this area right here and just stacked up. And that's what this picture is. This is using forward-facing sonar, looking back into the marina. Every one of these little dots right here is a fish. So they had pulled off from the flat, off from making beds, and pulled down to here. And these harder images right here, you can't see behind them because of how the imaging works, but those were big cement blocks. And I was actually using my forward-facing sonar not so much to pick off fish, but to not snag these blocks, because there wasn't a whole lot of room to make casts in there because the docks came out, there were boats, it was a marina. But once you found the right area to make the cast, you can make these casts and catch these fish. These fish were super lethargic, and I never did find the better quality fish here. I couldn't find it. I had looked everywhere on this map for the better quality fish. I could find the bucks, but the females I could never find on this. But luckily, it was such a hard weekend for everybody that worked out. Basically the top 3 guys caught a limit, and everybody else was short on fish. It was such a hard weekend. It was such a big cold snap. And I kept on thinking that the fish were going to be super, super deep because the cold snap was so severe, but they didn't pull off much. They only pulled down to like 5 to 8 feet. It was not deep water. You can see right here, am I sitting in 10 feet of water, and that's probably the deepest hole that I was sitting in. 40-degree water.
Was that water level consistent, or was it coming up or down? I know that's TDA, right? So
that is TDA, and honestly, that weekend I don't remember if it was coming up or down, or if it was really doing anything.
Okay.
I didn't notice it coming up or down. It was the only thing I honestly noticed is just how cold I was the whole time, because it was just you were there. I mean, yeah, it was just super cold the whole time.
One fish, 2 days, like type tournament.
Yeah. And so in this tournament, it ended up being just get a limit, right? Just find the fish that will bite, because other people were finding fish. And here's the deal too. So I came here on day one. That was the first place I went on day one. Drove down. I went to that area. I found the fish. I caught one fish there on a blade bait. I was like, man. And then I was like, this isn't going to work. They're here, but I can't get them to bite. I spent 4 days looking all over the rest of the lake. Didn't get another bite on a bass. I caught everything else. Caught walleye, sauger. I mean, pike. I mean, it was a fun weekend, but. And it all came down to this spot, and I went back there, and I had dug out of my box. I was like, I had such a bad week of fishing. I'm like, I'm gonna go back there. I have 15 minutes left to fish before we couldn't fish anymore. And I tied on. I have one package of what I use for white bass. This little tiny itty bitty swim bait that I showed you earlier, and threw it in there, and that was the magic bait. That was the only thing they would bite on in there. And it was such a specific thing. But I wouldn't have found this spot if I didn't trace it out from the creek. Because I literally went up this spot and kept on looking. I found these wide area in the creeks that had boulders in them. I'm like, man, where are the fish? They got to be here. And they weren't, but they were at the very end. And again, I mean, this is one of those things where fish do weird things, right? Would you think that fish are going to be in 9 feet of water next to the spawning bed in 40-degree water when it's 30-degree air temperatures? Me personally, no, but now I'm for sure always going to look shallow. And part of that is keeping an open mind for this stuff, because these fish are going to do different things.
I feel like cold snaps like that happen so quick that bass that do move up don't have enough time to justify going back out so deep, so they just pull down as much as they can into like a ditch.
Yeah,
snug the bottom.
And I totally agree with you on that. In that situation for Barr, we were cold for that whole week. I mean, leading up to it, I was really expecting to be pulled way back. But also, now again, that's Barr, that's Tennessee. I don't think those fish are smart enough or deal with those type of climate changes enough to realize I need to pull back to the deeper water, like they would here. If we had a week of cold water here, fishing a lake, I'd pull. I mean, the fish are going to be deeper. They're just going to pull out and go deeper. But those fish were just dumb. They just didn't move. They just pulled off a little bit, and we're like, we're just going to wait. Yeah, it's been cold for another day. We'll wait some more. It's going to be cold another day. We'll wait some more. And I went there day one of practice, and then came back for the tournament. That was like almost a week later, and they were still held up in the same spot, hadn't moved. You know, so it's one of those things, and that was one of those tournaments that honestly really opened up my eyes to how the fish are moving around and what they're willing to tolerate. So this one was Kentucky Lake for the National Championship in 2017, and this place was like, for me, this was gold. And it was all about stake beds, and every one of these markings here is a stake bed. Every single one of those is a stake bed, and they were actually, this is one of those situations where you could pull up Navionics and they were marked in Navionics. This is this isn't hidden info. This wasn't like I stumbled across it. This is like looking at a map and going, stake beds. Wow, there's a lot of stake beds in that cove. Wow, when I look out at the cove, there's ledges to fish on the way out, and there's road beds. Oh, and look at that beautiful creek that runs from 60 plus feet of water all the way to the very back. And this was actually 2 creeks that came together back here, so it was like a really substantial creek system on the other side of it as well. So this is one of those places that really paid off for me, obviously. It did really well. But again, the story about this place was one day, the first day of the National Championship, they were all in stake beds. And they were shallow. These stake beds are in 5 feet or less of water back here. You could literally see the tops of the stakes coming out of the water. Super shallow water. But then what happened? Day 2, The cold front comes in, like in every tournament you ever do that's 2 days, there's always a cold front that comes in on the second day. And as soon as I opened the door to leave, it was so cold outside and the wind was blowing in my face, I knew it wasn't going to be the same bite. I go back there, I catch one fish off the steak beds, and I spent, I don't know, a couple hours doing the rotation, right? Hitting them, running around, hitting them, to realize that that was not going to work. And so what did I do? Instead of going deep and coming up the creek, I went shallow and I started going out the creek. Right? And I got about here, and what this isn't showing you on the Navionics, and this goes to having good electronics and mapping an area, is this doesn't show it, but there's a ledge here that goes from this island over to here. And they were stacked up on that ledge. You can see it a little bit better here. They were stacked up right here, and this actually extends over to this. And they were stacked up on the secondary ledge, and I was going out to the deeper ledges, but I was following the creek out. And when I did that, that's what I saw. That's the drop that you don't see on Navionics, but was there. And these fish weren't biting down here. They were biting up on the ledge every once in a while. Every once in a while, one of those fish would come up and feed on the ledge and then go back down and sit down here. I couldn't get them to bite, but spending literally all day, the rest of the day, fishing this ledge up here and fishing it really, really slow with a really, really small worm got me 5 bites. I only got 5 bites the second day of the tournament. But there were the 5 right bites that cinched the deal for me. Now, of course, I'm sitting on a waypoint that I made right there. And so that's the importance of like following these creeks out, is that if I didn't follow that creek, I would have never found those fish, because I didn't find any other fish looking around. I only found them in that one spot, and they were, I mean, if you can see in that picture, they were stacked up in there thick. And that's where the better fish were, because there were other people that were out there fishing these ledges up here, these shallow ledges right here, and then fishing these roads, and they were all catching fish, but they weren't catching this quality fish. And that's why it's important to look around, because if you find a really juicy area that looks like it's good fishing, it is good fishing. There are big fish there. It's just finding exactly where they're hanging out. Because this creek, I mean, that's a pretty big area right there to fish. You know, and the big fish weren't just like sitting in one spot, and they moved. And when they moved together and joined up in like a big giant school. So they literally pulled out from all these places and down there, and the bigger fish were hanging out together, and the smaller fish were the ones that were staying on these road beds and being around here in all these different areas to fish. So for me, it just boils down to not just finding the fish, but looking around and finding that better structure for the better quality fish. Anybody got any questions?
How'd you figure out so that the line where you found where that ledge is that you can follow in the creek channel? Like, to me, when I look at that and I see the white and then the blue like separate, I don't see a creek channel at all. If you take away the green lines, I don't see a creek channel at all.
You would though. You see these dotted lines right there?
Oh.
That is the creek channel.
I'm blind, so.
I'm following, I was literally following what Navionics was telling me.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I wasn't following necessarily contour lines, you know, because this was really deceptive here. It really wasn't this deep right here, you know, and it fell off pretty dramatically, you know, right here. So that was very deceptive right there as far as it being a creek line, but I was literally just following what Navionics was showing me to follow. And I just put those green lines on there to help. Highlight something like you see anything wherever. You can kind of see here too, right? I got a little off the creek channel. And yeah, for me, so it's like creek channels. Creek channels, creek channel, creek channels, bigger boulders, bigger structure that's out of the wind, that's protected. That's what it really boils down to. For me, that's early spring bass. And all these things I showed you, every one of these places were the first places I picked on map study. So map study's key. You're going to a new lake, looking at the map and spending some time thinking about what time of season is just super huge for me. So that's early spring bass fishing up into the point when they spawn. Then once they spawn, they're obviously moving out to deep waters and spreading out. They are no longer going to be schooling up like they do pre-spawn. You'll find them schooling up a little bit post-spawn, but usually the schools start dying off then. And that's it.
So when you find them, you know, how long will you, I guess you feel confident that they're in your electronics, how long will you stay there trying to catch that school before you move on? I guess how long will you go without catching before you?
Man, that's like a hard answer for me to say I mean, I can tell you what I do, and I obsess over it, right? Once I find them and I think they're better quality fish, I won't move for days. I literally came back to the Watts Barr spot. I fished it 2 days. The first day of my practice, then I was down there for 4 days, and then I came back that 4th day and went back to it because I saw the fish there in my fish finder. I was confident that they were there. I just hadn't figured out what to get them to bite on. Now, luckily, when I went back, the first thing I threw was this really small bait, and it worked. But I will sit there on a school. If I'm on a school and I'm on my fish finder, I'm like, those are big bass. I feel confident in it. I will waste a lot of time to figure it out because they'll eat something, man. Whether they're gonna whether it's a reaction bait that you have to get them to react to something, whether it's a color change, a size change, or a profile change. Because sometimes they're eating. Sometimes they want to chase stuff, right? So they'll eat a swim bait, a crankbait. Other times they don't. Other times they want to come up and look at something and not have it move. I mean, I waste so much time trying so many different things. Has that burned me before? Yeah. I have wasted too much time on fish that just wouldn't bite. But it does pay off sometimes. And it's a hard answer to call because everyone's different, man, you know. If you're someone who needs to move around a little bit to feel comfortable, that's probably not going to be your style. But man, I mean, I get like blinders on. You know? I'm like looking at my fish finder like this, like, oh, he moved. He's going to eat it, you know, and I'll just sit there like that. And I'll change like green. Yeah, it is a curse. It is a curse. Anyone else got any other questions? Well, guys, thanks for coming. Man, there's a lot of stuff going on in Strictly Sail downstairs. Please feel free to hang out. If you guys have any other questions afterwards, you want to talk about fishing, please come on up.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you.